Imagine waking up one morning to learn that an attack on the other side of the world has sparked a war that will affect millions of people. A war that spreads across thousands of islands, vast oceans, and entire continents. The war in the Pacific during the Second World War. Even today, historians debate a central question. Was the attack on Pearl Harbor really inevitable, or could the Pacific War perhaps have been prevented? That's exactly what I want to hear your opinion about today. Write what you think in the comments below. Was the war inevitable, or could a different decision by political leaders have changed history? In this video, we take a look at one of the largest and most dramatic theaters of war in world history. We follow the events from the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to massive naval battles, fierce battles for small islands in the middle of the Pacific, to the last days of the war that finally led to its end. This is not only about battles and strategies, but also about decisions that determine the fate of entire nations. If you are interested in history and want to learn more about such events, please support this video with a like. And if you don't want to miss any more videos about history, big conflicts, and exciting events of the past, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. But now we begin our journey back to a time when the Pacific became the scene of a war that would change the world forever. Chapter 1: The Road to War. To understand how war in the Pacific could have come about, you have to start many years before the actual fighting. The conflict did not arise suddenly, but developed over decades from political tensions, economic interests, and the quest for power and influence in Asia. Long before the first bombs fell and the world's great fleets clashed, the foundation stone was laid for one of the largest theaters of war of the Second World War. At the beginning of the 20th century, Japan was in a phase of profound change. After the country had been largely isolated for centuries, it had modernized rapidly in the second half of the 19th century. Industry, military, and government were redesigned according to the Western model. Within a few decades, Japan developed into one of the strongest powers in Asia. But with this new strength, the desire for influence and control over other territories also grew. Many Japanese politicians and military leaders were convinced that their country could only remain strong in the long term if it had access to raw materials and new markets. Japan itself had limited natural resources. However, a growing industry required large quantities of oil, iron, coal, and other raw materials. These were mainly found in the countries and colonies of Southeast Asia. At the same time, many Japanese nationalists wanted to establish their country as the leading power in East Asia. As early as the early decades of the century, Japan therefore began to expand its influence. A decisive step was the war against Russia in 1904. For many observers at the time, it was surprising that an Asian country could defeat a European great power. But that is exactly what happened. Japan's victory over Russia made it clear that Japan had become a great military power. This success strengthened the country's self-confidence and strengthened those forces that advocated further expansion. In the years that followed, Japan expanded its influence to the Korean peninsula. In 1910, Korea was finally officially annexed by Japan and made a colony. For Japan, this meant an important strategic and economic gain. At the same time, a development was already evident here that would later play an even greater role: the increasing weight of the military in politics. While other states tried to solve their conflicts diplomatically, in Japan the military in particular gained more and more influence. Many officers believed that their country could only secure its future through strength and expansion. In their eyes, Asia was a space dominated by Western colonial powers. Countries such as Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands controlled large parts of Southeast Asia. Japanese nationalists therefore argued that Japan also had a right to its own empire. The Great Depression of the late 1920s further exacerbated these developments. When the global economy collapsed, Japan was also hit hard. Unemployment rose, many companies ran into difficulties, and the political situation became increasingly unstable. In this atmosphere, radical voices gained more and more support. Especially in the military, the conviction prevailed that expansion was the only way to solve the country's economic problems. A decisive turning point came in 1931. In that year, The Japanese army occupied Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China. Officially, the invasion was justified by an alleged attack on a Japanese railway line. But many historians today agree that this incident was deliberately staged to justify military intervention. Within a short time, Japan controlled the entire territory and established a new state there under Japanese control. The international community reacted with criticism, but there were no serious consequences. This weak response strengthened many Japanese military leaders in their belief that they could pursue their goals without much resistance. At the same time, relations between Japan and China have increasingly deteriorated. In 1937, an open war finally broke out between the two countries. The conflict began with an incident near Beijing and quickly escalated into a full-scale war. Japanese troops advanced deep into China and captured several major cities. The war was marked by great brutality and dragged on for many years. For Japan, however, this conflict also meant an enormous burden, because the resistance of the Chinese armed forces was stronger than expected. As the war in China continued to expand, other powers also watched the developments with growing concern. The United States in particular was increasingly critical of Japan's expansion. The U.S. had economic interests in the region and supported China politically and economically. At the same time, many American politicians were convinced that Japan's aggressive policy posed a threat to stability in the Pacific. In the late 1930s, tensions between the two countries intensified significantly. The U.S. began to exert economic pressure on Japan. Of particular importance was control over strategic raw materials. Since Japan was heavily reliant on imports, economic sanctions could have a major impact. A particularly drastic step was the American oil embargo. Oil was crucial to Japan's industry and military. Without sufficient supplies, neither the economy nor the navy could function in the long term. For the Japanese leadership, therefore, a central question arose. Should one give in to the demands of the United States and stop the expansion in China, or should one try to secure new sources of raw materials by military force? In Tokyo, intensive discussions began about the country's future strategy. Some politicians pleaded for negotiations and compromises with the United States. Others, however, especially in the military, saw this as a sign of weakness. They argued that Japan could secure its position only by acting decisively. At the same time, another option increasingly became the focus of strategic considerations. If Japan were to conquer the resource-rich regions of Southeast Asia, it could solve its economic problems and become independent of American supplies. But such a step would inevitably lead to a conflict with the Western colonial powers. The United States, in particular, was considered the biggest obstacle. The American Pacific Fleet, stationed in Hawaii, posed a serious threat to any Japanese expansion. As long as this fleet existed, Japanese military planners could not be sure of achieving their goals in the Pacific. Against this background, the Japanese military leadership began to think about a possible preemptive strike. The idea was risky, but logical from the point of view of many officers. If it were possible to decisively weaken the American fleet at the beginning of a war, Japan could gain enough time to carry out its planned conquests in Southeast Asia and build a strong line of defense in the Pacific. While these plans were becoming more and more concrete, diplomatic talks between Japan and the United States were still underway at the same time. Both sides tried to avoid escalation, but the positions were far apart. For the U.S., Japan's withdrawal from China was a central demand. For the Japanese leadership, however, such a step was hardly acceptable. Thus, both countries moved step by step towards a conflict. Mistrust, economic pressure, and strategic rivalry further exacerbated the situation. In the end, the decision was made to change the history of the Pacific and the entire world forever. The way to war was thus paved. Tensions had reached a level where a peaceful solution became increasingly unlikely. Behind closed doors, military planners were already working on an attack that would mark the beginning of a new and devastating chapter in world history. Chapter 2: Japan's expansion in Asia. By the time tensions between Japan and the Western powers continued to escalate in the 1930s, Japan's expansion in Asia had long since begun. The path to a major Pacific War was paved not only by diplomatic conflicts and economic rivalries, but also by a series of military decisions that fundamentally changed the balance of power in East Asia. Step by step, Japan transformed itself from a regional power into an aggressively expanding empire. A decisive starting point for this development was Manchuria. This vast region in northeastern China was rich in raw materials, had fertile soils, and had an important strategic location between China, Russia, and Korea. For many Japanese military strategists, Manchuria was therefore an ideal target to strengthen Japan's economic and military position. In 1931, the Japanese military used an incident along a railway line as a pretext for an invasion. Within a short time, Japanese troops advanced into the region and took control of large parts of the area. Soon a new state was founded there, which was officially independent, but in reality was completely controlled by Japan. This development marked an important turning point, as it showed that Japan was willing to ignore international rules in order to advance its own interests. However, the reactions of the international community remained comparatively weak. Although several countries criticized Japan's actions, concrete measures hardly followed. For many Japanese military leaders, this was a signal that their strategy was working. If foreign resistance remained limited, they could continue to expand. In the years that followed, the influence of the military within Japan continued to grow. Politicians who advocated diplomatic solutions increasingly lost importance. Instead, generals and admirals increasingly determined the political direction of the country. In this atmosphere, expansion was no longer seen as just a possibility, but as a necessary step for Japan's future. This development was particularly evident in relation to China. Although the two countries had previously had conflicts, tensions increased dramatically in the 1930s. China itself was in a difficult position at the time. The country was politically fragmented, several regional centers of power competed for influence, and the government also fought against internal uprisings. This situation seemed to offer an opportunity from a Japanese perspective. In 1937, there was finally an incident near Beijing, which quickly developed into open war. Within a few weeks, the conflict escalated into a large-scale campaign. Japanese troops advanced deep into Chinese territory and captured several important cities. Japan's military superiority was initially clearly evident. The Japanese army was better equipped, better organized, and had modern weapons. Many Chinese units, on the other hand, were poorly equipped and often had to fight under difficult conditions. Nevertheless, China managed to maintain the resistance and continue the war for years. As the war expanded, the Japanese Empire continued to grow. Japanese troops occupied large parts of China's coastal regions and important trading centers. The aim of this strategy was to weaken China's economic base while strengthening Japan's own position. But the war developed differently than many Japanese military planners had expected. Instead of ending quickly, the conflict dragged on and on. The resistance of the Chinese armed forces remained, and more resources had to be used to control the occupied territories. At the same time, Japan began to propagate its vision of a new order in Asia. In official propaganda, there was often talk of a community of Asian nations that would stand together against the influence of the Western colonial powers. This idea was presented as a kind of liberation movement in which Japan would take the leading role. In reality, however, the situation was often different. In many occupied territories, Japanese rule was perceived as an occupation by the local population. Economic exploitation, military control, and political repression led to an increase in resistance to Japan in several regions. At the same time, as the war in China intensified, Japan began to expand its strategic goals. Military planners increasingly looked to Southeast Asia. This region was of great importance because it had enormous quantities of raw materials. Oil, rubber and tin in particular were of crucial importance to Japan's industry and military. However, many of these resources were located in areas controlled by European colonial powers. The Netherlands owned large parts of Indonesia, Britain controlled Malaya and Singapore, and France ruled over Indochina. As long as these colonial empires existed, Japan's access to the resources remained limited. But the global political situation changed increasingly. In Europe, the Second World War had already begun, and many European states were heavily involved in the fighting on their own continent. This opened up a new strategic opportunity for Japan. If it were possible to conquer the colonies in Southeast Asia, Japan could not only solve its raw material problems, but also build a huge empire. At the same time, however, such a step would almost inevitably lead to a conflict with the United States, which also had important interests in the region. While these considerations became more and more concrete, Japan continued its military activities in Asia. Indochina in particular increasingly came into focus. When France was weakened in the war against Germany, Japan seized the opportunity to expand its influence in the region. Japanese troops advanced into several areas of Indochina and secured important military bases. These positions were strategically extremely valuable, as they provided an ideal starting point for further operations in Southeast Asia. But it was precisely these steps that alarmed the United States. In Washington, Japan's expansion was watched with growing concern. The American government feared that Japan could soon try to control other regions and thus massively change the balance of power in the Pacific. In response, the U.S. began to exert economic pressure on Japan. The restriction of raw material supplies was particularly decisive. For a country that was heavily reliant on imports, such measures posed a serious threat. Within Japan, this situation further exacerbated political tensions. While some voices continued to argue for diplomatic solutions, many military leaders argued that Japan needed to act before its economic situation became even more difficult. This created a situation in which expansion was seen not only as a strategic option, but as a seemingly necessary step. Japan's leadership believed that it would either act quickly or lose influence in the long term. However, with each further step in Asia, the risk of a larger conflict also grew. Japan's expansion had already engulfed large parts of China, and now strategic planning was increasingly focused on Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The decisions made in these years eventually led to a dramatic escalation of the situation. Diplomatic talks, economic pressure, and military planning took place simultaneously, while several major powers prepared for a possible confrontation. Japan's expansion had thus reached a dynamic that could hardly be stopped. What had originally begun as a regional power struggle developed more and more into a conflict of global significance. And while the world was slowly preparing for a major war, military strategists were already working on a plan that would change the course of history. Chapter 3: The Attack on Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7, 1941, everything seemed calm on the island of Oahu in the Pacific. The American naval base Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was an important base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but on this Sunday morning hardly anyone suspected that a large Japanese attack fleet was approaching only a few hundred kilometers away. Within a few hours, this place would turn into a battlefield and finally lead the United States into World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not a spontaneous event. It was the result of months of planning, strategic considerations, and intensive preparation. The Japanese military leadership had concluded that war with the United States might have become inevitable. Economic sanctions, especially the American oil embargo, had put Japan under great pressure. Without sufficient oil reserves, Japanese industry and especially the Navy would become unable to act in the long term. For many military planners in Tokyo, a crucial question therefore arose. If war with the U.S. was imminent anyway, wouldn't it be better to strike first? A quick and surprise attack could weaken the American Pacific Fleet to such an extent that Japan would gain sufficient time to carry out its planned conquests in Southeast Asia and establish a strong line of defense in the Pacific. One of the central figures behind this plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese fleet. Yamamoto knew the United States well, having lived there for several years. He knew that America's industrial strength was enormous and that a long war could be very dangerous for Japan. That was precisely why he was convinced that a quick, surprising blow was necessary. The idea was to attack the American fleet directly from its main base in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor seemed to be an ideal destination for this. The base was far from the American mainland, and many American ships regularly anchored there. If it were to succeed in destroying a large part of the fleet, the United States could potentially take several months or even years to recover from this blow. Preparations for the attack began in early 1941, when Japanese military strategists developed a detailed plan that included a large fleet of aircraft carriers, warships, and escort ships. The use of aircraft was particularly important because they were to carry out the attack from the air. 6 aircraft carriers were selected for the operation, an exceptionally strong force for the time. Hundreds of aircraft were on them, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter planes. For weeks, the pilots trained under realistic conditions to prepare for the attack. At the same time, Japan attached great importance to secrecy. The entire attack fleet was to move unnoticed across the Pacific and only reach its position shortly before the attack. Radio silence was strictly prescribed so that no evidence of the operation could leak out. At the end of November 1941, the Japanese fleet finally left its ports and began its long voyage across the North Pacific. The route was deliberately chosen to be as far away as possible from the usual shipping routes. Despite the huge distance, the fleet managed to remain undetected. While the Japanese attack group was approaching Hawaii, diplomatic talks between Japan and the United States were still underway in Washington. Both sides officially tried to avoid an escalation. But behind the scenes, Japan had already decided to carry out the attack. In the early morning of December 7th, the Japanese fleet reached its launch position north of Hawaii. Preparations for the attack began before sunrise. The first aircraft were deployed on the decks of the aircraft carriers. Engines were started and final orders were given. Shortly after 6 o'clock in the morning, the first wave of attacks started. More than 180 aircraft rose from the aircraft carriers and flew towards Oahu. Their destination was clear: the American warships, airfields, and military installations around Pearl Harbor. As the planes approached the island, the surprise was almost perfect. The American armed forces had received some warning signals, but they were not properly classified. No one seriously expected an attack on Hawaii. The attack began shortly before 8 o'clock in the morning. The first Japanese plane surfaced over Pearl Harbor and opened fire. Bombs and torpedoes hit the ships in the harbor, while other planes attacked American airfields to destroy as many planes as possible on the ground. Within minutes, the quiet naval base turned into a chaos of explosions, smoke, and burning ships. The American battleships, which were lying close to each other in the harbor, were hit particularly hard. Several of them were hit by torpedoes or bombs. One of the most dramatic events of the attack was the explosion of the battleship USS Arizona. A bomb hit the ship and triggered a huge explosion in the ammunition depot. Within a few seconds, the ship was destroyed and sank in the harbor. Hundreds of sailors lost their lives in the process. Meanwhile, more Japanese planes attacked American airfields. Many U.S. Army planes stood close to each other on the tarmacs and became easy targets for the attackers. Numerous machines were destroyed before they could even take off. About an hour after the attack began, a second wave of Japanese planes reached Pearl Harbor. They also attacked military targets again and caused further severe damage. In the meantime, the American armed forces tried to defend themselves. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, and some American fighter planes were finally able to take off. But by this time, the surprise effect had already been fully unfolded. Many ships had been severely damaged or sunk, numerous aircraft had been destroyed, and hundreds of people had already died. After about 2 hours, the attack was finally over. The Japanese planes returned to their aircraft carriers and began the return flight over the Pacific. From a Japanese point of view, the operation was initially a great success. A large part of the American battleships had been destroyed or severely damaged. But despite the heavy losses, the attack was not as decisive as some Japanese military planners had hoped. Several important targets had remained unscathed. Crucially, the American aircraft carriers were not in port. These ships would later play a central role in the further course of the Pacific War. Important facilities such as fuel depots, repair docks, and submarine bases also remained largely intact. This allowed the United States to resume its military activities in the Pacific faster than Japan had expected. For the American people, the attack was a shock. Many people had hoped that the United States could stay out of the war. But the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. The next day, the American government officially declared war on Japan. The attack, which was supposed to strengthen Japan's strategic position, thus had a decisive effect. It united the American people and mobilized the enormous industrial and military power of the United States. The Pacific War had now finally begun. What began as a surprise attack on a naval base soon developed into a massive conflict across thousands of miles of ocean. A war that would affect millions of people and change the course of world history. Chapter 4: Japan's Rapid Advance. The attack on Pearl Harbor not only marked the United States' entry into World War II, but was also the prelude to a series of military operations that Japan had planned well in advance. While the world was still reacting to the events in Hawaii, the Japanese Army and Navy simultaneously began a large-scale offensive throughout East and Southeast Asia. Within a few weeks, Japan conquered a vast territory, creating one of the largest empires in its history. The attack on Pearl Harbor was only one part of a much larger plan. Japan's military leadership knew that it could only achieve its strategic goals if several regions were attacked at the same time. The idea was simple. While the American fleet was weakened by the attack on Hawaii, Japanese forces in other parts of the Pacific were to quickly capture important areas before the Allies could reorganize. Only a few hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, further Japanese operations began. One of the first target regions was the Philippines. This archipelago of islands was then under American control and had great strategic importance. From there, the United States was able to conduct military operations throughout the Western Pacific. Japanese planes attacked American airfields in the Philippines and destroyed many planes while they were still on the ground. Shortly thereafter, Japanese troops landed on several islands and began their advance inland. Despite resistance from American and Philippine forces, Japan managed to control large parts of the archipelago within a few weeks. But the Philippines was only one of many destinations. At the same time, Japan also attacked British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia. The Malay Peninsula was particularly important. This area belonged to the British Empire and was rich in natural resources, especially rubber and tin. In addition, one of the most important British military bases in the Far East was located there, Singapore. The Japanese offensive against Malaya also began in December 1941, with Japanese troops landing in several places along the coast and advancing rapidly south. In doing so, they used surprising tactics and often moved faster than the Allied forces had expected. Particularly effective was the use of light vehicles and bicycles, which allowed Japanese soldiers to move quickly through the terrain. The British and Commonwealth troops defending the region were hardly prepared for such an attack. Many military plans had focused on repelling a possible attack from the sea. But Japan attacked over land instead, surprising the defenders. Within a few weeks, Japanese troops advanced further and further south. Finally, they reached Singapore, which was considered one of the strongest fortresses of the British Empire. But despite its strong defenses, the city was ill-prepared for an attack from this direction. In February 1942, Singapore finally fell after only a few days of intense fighting. The surrender of the British garrison was a major blow to the British Empire and was considered one of the greatest military defeats in its history. For Japan, on the other hand, the victory was an enormous success, which significantly strengthened its own position in Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, Japan continued its expansion in other regions as well. Particularly important was the area of present-day Indonesia, then known as the Dutch East Indies. This region had large oil reserves, which were crucial to Japan's war economy. Japanese forces attacked several islands in the archipelago and were able to capture important cities and ports within a short time. The Dutch armed forces and their allies tried to resist, but their forces were limited and poorly coordinated. A decisive phase of these battles was the Battle of the Java Sea. In this naval battle, Allied naval units tried to stop the Japanese advance. But the Japanese Navy proved superior and was able to sink several Allied ships. After this defeat, the way was largely clear for the Japanese conquest of the region. With control of the Dutch East Indies, Japan now had access to much-needed oil reserves. It was precisely these resources that had been one of the main reasons why Japan had begun its expansion in Southeast Asia. But Japan's advance was not limited to Southeast Asia. In the Pacific itself, Japanese forces also occupied several island groups, including Guam, Wake Island, and other strategically important bases. These islands were important in establishing a line of defense and securing control over large parts of the Pacific. Within a few months, Japan had conquered a vast territory that stretched from Manchuria in the north to Indonesia in the south and from Burma in the west to the islands in the Central Pacific. Never before had Japan controlled such a large empire. For many observers, it seemed as if Japan was almost unstoppable during this phase. The Allies suffered one defeat after another, and their forces had to retreat in many regions. Especially in the first months of 1942, it seemed that Japan could achieve its goals without much difficulty. But despite these impressive successes, there were already early signs that Japan's expansion would cause problems in the long term. The newly conquered empire was huge and difficult to defend. Many areas were far apart and had to be controlled over long supply routes. In addition, Japan underestimated the industrial and military strength of the United States in some respects. Although the attack on Pearl Harbor had inflicted heavy losses on the American fleet, the USA had enormous production capacities. Soon, American industry began to produce new ships, aircraft, and weapons in large quantities. At the same time, resistance also grew in several occupied territories. In China, the armed forces continued to fight against the Japanese army. Resistance movements were also formed in other regions to fight against the occupation. So while Japan continued to control large areas, a new phase of the war slowly began to emerge. The Allies began to reorganize their forces and develop strategies to stop the Japanese advance. A decisive moment in this process was soon to follow. In 1942, several major naval battles would take place, which were to fundamentally change the course of the Pacific War. But at that time, Japan still seemed to be at the height of its power. Within a few months, the country had built a huge empire and won numerous military victories. Japan's rapid advance had dramatically changed the balance of power in the Pacific. The question that now arose, however, was different. Would Japan succeed in defending this huge empire in the long term? Or would the Allies soon begin to reconquer the lost territories step by step? Chapter 5: The War in the Philippines. When Japan began its large-scale offensive in the Pacific in December 1941, the Philippines was one of the most important targets of Japan's military strategy. The sprawling archipelago of islands was located at a crucial strategic position between Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. For the United States, it represented an important military outpost, while for Japan it was an obstacle on the way to the resource-rich regions of Southeast Asia. As long as American forces were stationed there, they could threaten Japanese supply lines and disrupt operations throughout the Western Pacific. Only a few hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the attack on the Philippines began. Japanese planes took off from bases on Taiwan and attacked American airfields on the islands. The attack took the defenders by surprise. Many aircraft of the American Air Force were still standing close together on the tarmacs when the first bombs fell. Within a short time, numerous machines were destroyed or severely damaged. This first air attack significantly weakened the defenses of the Philippines. Without sufficient air support, it became much more difficult for the American and Philippine troops to stop the Japanese advance. Shortly after, Japanese troops began several landings on various islands of the archipelago. At this time, the defenders were under the command of American General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was an experienced officer and had already spent many years in the Philippines. His task was to defend the islands and stop the Japanese advance for as long as possible. But the initial situation was difficult. Although the American and Philippine armed forces had a significant number of soldiers, many units were inadequately equipped or poorly trained. Modern weapons, tanks and aircraft were in short supply, and the supply situation was already tense before the fighting began. Japan, on the other hand, had carefully prepared its offensive. Well-trained troops, supported by aircraft and warships, advanced quickly and were able to capture several strategically important points. Especially on the main island of Luzon, an intense battle soon developed. In view of Japan's rapid progress, MacArthur finally decided to make a strategic adjustment. Instead of trying to defend the entire archipelago, Allied forces focused on a defensive position on the Bataan Peninsula, as well as on Corregidor Island, which controlled the entrance to Manila Bay. This decision followed a defense plan that had already been worked out beforehand. The idea was to hold off Japanese troops for as long as possible while waiting for reinforcements from the United States. In practice, however, it quickly became clear that this hope was hardly realistic. The American fleet had suffered heavy losses from the attack on Pearl Harbor, and additional troops could not be sent in time. While the defenders retreated to Bataan, one of the most difficult phases of the war began in the Philippines. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers tried to resist under increasingly difficult conditions. The Japanese forces surrounded the peninsula and cut off the supply routes. Soon, the supply of food, medicine, and ammunition became a major problem. Supplies were originally only available for a much shorter period of time, but the battle lasted much longer than expected. Many soldiers suffered from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Despite these difficult conditions, the defenders managed to resist for several months. Again and again, Japanese troops tried to break through the defensive lines, but the Allied soldiers continued to fight stubbornly. Especially in the dense jungle terrain of the peninsula, numerous fierce battles developed. Meanwhile, however, the situation of the defense attorneys continued to deteriorate. Diseases such as malaria and dysentery were spreading, and many soldiers were physically exhausted. At the same time, the Japanese armed forces received reinforcements again and again. In March 1942, a difficult decision finally arrived. The American government ordered General MacArthur to leave the Philippines and go to Australia to organize further resistance against Japan. Although MacArthur was reluctant to leave, he finally obeyed this order. Before leaving the islands, however, he spoke a phrase that would later become a symbol of American resistance in the Pacific. He promised, "I shall return." For many soldiers in the Philippines, this promise became an important sign of hope. After MacArthur left the islands, the resistance continued on Bataan, but the situation remained critical. At the beginning of April 1942, the defenders were finally completely exhausted. Many units had hardly any food or ammunition left. On April 9, 1942, the American Philippine Army had to surrender on Bataan. This surrender marked the beginning of one of the most tragic chapters of the war in the Philippines. Thousands of captured soldiers were forced by Japanese troops to start a long march inland. This march later became known as the so-called Bataan Death March. The prisoners had to travel great distances in extreme conditions, often without sufficient water or food. Many soldiers were already sick or wounded, but they still had to keep going. Those who collapsed or could no longer walk were often abused or left behind. Thousands of people died during this march. The events left deep marks and later became one of the best-known examples of the cruelty of the Pacific War. But even after the fall of Bataan, the battle was not yet completely over. On the island of Corregidor, American and Philippine forces continued to hold out. The island was heavily fortified and had several underground defenses. However, Japanese forces soon began intense bombing and artillery attacks. Day and night, the defensive positions were shelled, while preparations for an invasion were underway. In May 1942, Japanese troops finally launched their attack on Corregidor. After heavy fighting and in view of the hopeless situation, this last defensive position also had to capitulate. This put an end to the organized resistance of the Allied forces in the Philippines for the time being. Japan had now taken control of the entire archipelago. For the Japanese military leadership, this was an important strategic success. The Philippines could now be used as part of the Japanese defense line in the Pacific. But despite this success, the war in the Philippines was far from over. Many Filipino soldiers and civilians refused to accept the Japanese occupation. Resistance groups were formed in various regions and continued to fight against the Japanese forces. These guerrilla fighters later played an important role when the Allies began to plan their counteroffensive in the Pacific. Information from the occupied territories, support from the local population, and the ongoing resistance contributed to the hope of a later liberation of the islands. So while Japan had seemingly won another major victory, the conflict in the Philippines remained an open chapter in the Pacific War. MacArthur's promise to return one day was still engraved in many people's minds, and a few years later, that promise was actually to be kept. Chapter 6: The Battle of the Coral Sea. In the spring of 1942, Japan was at the height of its military successes in the Pacific. Within a few months, the Japanese military had conquered a vast territory, from Hong Kong to Malaya and Singapore to the Philippines and the Dutch colonies in Indonesia. For many observers, it seemed as if the Japanese advance could hardly be stopped. But while Japan wanted to expand its empire further, the Allies slowly began to reorganize and plan initial countermeasures. One of the first major turning points was to occur in May 1942 in the Coral Sea. The Coral Sea is located northeast of Australia and south of New Guinea. This region was of great strategic importance, as it formed an important link between Australia and the United States. For Japan, this was an opportunity to further expand its line of defense and at the same time break the Allies' connection. The Japanese military therefore planned a new offensive. The goal was to conquer the port city of Port Moresby in the south of New Guinea. From there, Japan would have been in an ideal position to carry out airstrikes against northern Australia and threaten Allied supplies in the South Pacific. Moreover, such a conquest would have significantly expanded Japan's line of defense. To carry out this operation, Japan assembled a large fleet. This consisted of several warships, transports, and aircraft carriers that were to provide air support for the invasion. The plan was for Japanese troops to first attack Port Moresby and then secure other areas in the South Pacific. But this time the Allies were better prepared than in previous Japanese attacks. The American intelligence services had achieved an important success. They were able to decipher parts of Japanese radio communications and thus received information about the planned operation. This information allowed the U.S. Navy to take countermeasures in time. The American leadership decided to send a fleet into the Coral Sea to stop the Japanese invasion. This force consisted of, among other things, 2 American aircraft carriers as well as several cruisers and destroyers. In addition, Australian warships supported the operation. This meant that 2 large fleets were now facing each other, both of which had aircraft carriers. This development was of great importance, because it showed how much naval warfare had changed. In earlier times, battleships had been the most important units of a fleet. But in the Pacific War, air power increasingly played a decisive role. The Battle of the Coral Sea was therefore intended to represent a completely new form of naval battle. For the first time in history, 2 large fleets met without their main ships coming directly into sight of each other. Instead, the battle was mainly fought by aircraft taking off from the aircraft carriers. At the beginning of May 1942, the 2 fleets slowly came closer together. Both sides tried to discover the enemy's position, while at the same time reconnaissance aircraft were sent over the sea. In this phase, the search for the opponent played a decisive role. On May 7th, the first major attacks finally took place. American planes spotted a Japanese fleet and attacked it. In the process, they managed to severely damage a Japanese aircraft carrier and sink another ship. At the same time, Japanese aircraft also attacked Allied ships, causing several hits. The following day, the battle reached its climax. In the meantime, both sides had discovered the position of the enemy aircraft carriers and were preparing major airstrikes. Hundreds of kilometers apart, planes took off from the decks of the carriers and flew over the open sea to reach their destinations. When the assault units finally met the enemy fleets, one of the most intense air-sea battles of the entire war began. American dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked Japanese ships, while at the same time Japanese planes targeted the American carriers. Several ships were severely damaged. An American aircraft carrier suffered heavy hits from bombs and torpedoes and later had to be abandoned. Important ships were also damaged on the Japanese side, including a modern aircraft carrier that was so badly damaged that it was no longer operational for a long time. The battle lasted several hours and caused heavy casualties on both sides. Many aircraft were shot down or lost on the way back to their carriers. For the pilots, these missions meant an enormous risk, because they had to fly over long distances and often orientate themselves under difficult conditions. By the end of the battle, both sides had suffered heavy losses. Several warships had been damaged or sunk, and numerous aircraft were lost. But despite these losses, the battle had an important strategic effect. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby had to be called off. For the first time since the beginning of the Pacific War, the Allies had succeeded in stopping a major Japanese offensive. This success had not only military significance, but also an important psychological effect. After the many defeats of the first months of the war, the Battle of the Coral Sea showed that Japan was not invincible. The Allies had proven that they were able to stop Japan's advance. In addition, the battle also had long-term consequences for the further course of the war. Several Japanese aircraft carriers were damaged or lost many experienced pilots. These losses were to be felt a short time later in another decisive battle. The battle was also an important experience for the United States. The American Navy gathered valuable knowledge about the use of aircraft carriers and the coordination of airstrikes at sea. These experiences should play a decisive role in the coming years. The Battle of the Coral Sea therefore marked an important transition in the Pacific War. Although Japan remained a strong military power, its seemingly unstoppable advance had been halted for the first time. At the same time, it became increasingly clear that control of the Pacific would depend not only on large fleets, but above all on the ability to use air forces effectively. Aircraft carriers and their aircraft became the central element of naval warfare. Only 1 month after this battle, an even greater decisive battle was to be brewed in the Pacific. A battle that is considered by many historians to be the real turning point of the entire Pacific War. This next confrontation would take place in June 1942, near a small group of islands called Midway. Chapter 7: The Battle of Midway, Turning Point of the War. After the rapid successes of the first months of the war, Japan seemed to be in an extremely strong position in the spring of 1942. The Japanese Empire now extended over huge parts of East Asia and the Pacific. But Japan's military leadership knew that this success could only be secured in the long term if the American Navy was finally weakened. The American aircraft carriers in particular posed a serious threat. They had not been in port during the attack on Pearl Harbor and had therefore survived the attack. For the Japanese Navy, therefore, the focus was on a clear goal: to lure the American aircraft carriers into a trap and destroy them in a major naval battle. If successful, Japan could further expand its control over the Pacific and establish a line of defense that would be difficult for the United States to break. The plan for this operation was largely developed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese fleet. Yamamoto believed that a decisive battle was necessary to decide the war quickly. His plan was to attack an American base in the Central Pacific to force the American fleet to counterattack. The target of this operation was the small archipelago of Midway. Midway is located about halfway between Japan and Hawaii and was of great strategic importance. The island served as an important American base for reconnaissance aircraft and submarines. If Japan were to capture Midway, it could move the American defense line further east while posing a threat to Hawaii. The Japanese attack fleet was impressively large. Several battleships, cruisers, destroyers and transports accompanied 4 large aircraft carriers. These aircraft carriers were the heart of the Japanese fleet. From their decks, hundreds of aircraft could take off and carry out attacks over long distances. But although the Japanese plan was carefully crafted, it had a crucial weakness. As in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the American intelligence services succeeded in deciphering parts of Japanese communications. This gave the United States important clues about the planned operation. While the U.S. Navy did not know every detail of the Japanese plan, it recognized that an attack on Midway was imminent. This information gave the American armed forces a huge advantage. Instead of being surprised, they were able to prepare for the upcoming battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the American Pacific Fleet, decided to deploy several aircraft carriers near Midway. They were to strike at the right moment and attack the Japanese fleet. At the beginning of June 1942, the two fleets slowly approached the archipelago. Both sides knew that a great battle was coming, but no one could predict exactly how it would unfold. On the morning of June 4th, the operation began. Japanese planes took off from their aircraft carriers and flew towards Midway to attack the American base. Shortly thereafter, they reached the islands and attacked airfields, buildings, and defenses. The American defenders tried to repel the attack. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, and American planes took off to intercept the attackers. Despite this resistance, the Japanese bombs caused severe damage to the island. Meanwhile, American planes also took off from Midway to attack the Japanese fleet. However, many of these attacks were poorly coordinated and met with strong Japanese defenses. Numerous American planes were shot down without causing major damage. But while these battles were taking place, the American aircraft carrier fleet was approaching the Japanese assault group. Aircraft now also took off from the American carriers to search for and attack the Japanese ships. The search for the opponent was difficult. The Pacific Ocean is huge, and even large fleets can spread out over long distances. Several American attack groups flew over the sea for a long time without finding their targets. Eventually, however, American reconnaissance aircraft discovered the Japanese fleet. Shortly afterwards, several groups of American dive bombers reached the scene. At that moment, the Japanese aircraft carriers were in a particularly vulnerable situation. Many of their aircraft had just been prepared on the decks or in the hangars to launch another attack. Bombs and fuel were ready while the planes were being rearmed. When the American bombers appeared over the Japanese carriers, the Japanese defenders had little time to react. Within a few minutes, several bombs hit their targets. 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were badly hit. Explosions broke out, fires spread, and soon the ships were out of control. The fires could no longer be extinguished, and the ships finally had to be abandoned. The 4th Japanese aircraft carrier launched a counterattack and was able to severely damage an American carrier. But this ship was also later discovered and attacked by American aircraft. As a result, Japan lost 4 of its most important aircraft carriers within a few hours. These ships were among the most experienced and strongest units of the Japanese Navy. Along with them, many experienced drivers were lost, who were difficult to replace. This was a heavy blow for Japan. The Japanese fleet was eventually forced to retreat, and the plan to capture Midway failed completely. The Battle of Midway thus had enormous significance for the further course of the Pacific War. For the first time, Japan had not only lost an offensive, but also lost a large part of its experienced aircraft carrier fleet. For the United States, on the other hand, the battle was a decisive victory. The American Navy had proven that it was capable of defeating the Japanese fleet. At the same time, it gained valuable time to further expand its military forces. The situation in the Pacific also changed strategically. While Japan had previously had the initiative in the war, the Allies now slowly began to plan their own offensives. The victory at Midway finally stopped the Japanese advance and ushered in a new phase of the war. Instead of further rapid conquests, Japan now increasingly had to defend its existing territories. The Battle of Midway is therefore still considered one of the most important turning points of the entire Pacific War. Within a few hours, the balance of power on the open sea had changed fundamentally. But although the United States had now won an important victory, the war was far from over. In the years to come, many more bloody battles were to follow, at sea, in the air, and on small islands in the middle of the Pacific. One of these battles began just a few months later on a remote archipelago in the South Pacific. There, the next major phase of the war was to begin, the long and bitter battle for Guadalcanal. Chapter 8: Guadalcanal, the first major counterattack. After the decisive Battle of Midway in June 1942, the balance of power in the Pacific War slowly began to change. For the first time since the beginning of the conflict, the United States had won a major strategic victory. However, despite this success, Japan continued to control a vast territory in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Allies were now faced with the difficult task of seizing the initiative and pushing back the Japanese forces step by step. The first major attempt at such a counteroffensive was to begin on a small island in the South Pacific, Guadalcanal. This island belonged to the Solomon Islands and was located northeast of Australia. At first glance, Guadalcanal seemed inconspicuous, a tropical island with dense jungle, few roads, and a sparse population. But its location was of great strategic importance. In the summer of 1942, Japanese forces had begun to build an airfield on Guadalcanal. If this airfield were completed, Japanese aircraft would be able to control large parts of the South Pacific. The connection between the United States and Australia was particularly important. A large part of the supplies for the Allied forces ran along this route. The American leadership quickly realized that this airfield posed a serious threat. If Japan were to consolidate control of Guadalcanal, Japanese planes could attack the Allied supply routes and further isolate Australia. Therefore, the United States decided to attack the island before the airfield was fully completed. On August 7, 1942, the operation finally began. American Marines landed on Guadalcanal as well as on several neighboring islands. For the United States, this was the first major attack against Japanese-controlled territory in the Pacific. The landing came as a surprise to the Japanese defenders. The construction workers and soldiers on the island were lightly armed, and many of them had not expected such a quick attack. Within a short time, the American Marines managed to capture the unfinished airfield. This airfield was later renamed Henderson Field and would play a central role in the battle for the island over the course of the coming months. From here, American planes could take off and attack both Japanese ships and aircraft. But although the landing was initially successful, a long and difficult phase of the fight now began. The Japanese leadership was determined to retake Guadalcanal. In the months that followed, there were numerous battles at sea, in the air, and in the dense jungle of the island. Shortly after the American landing, Japan responded with a counterattack. A Japanese fleet attacked Allied ships near the island. In a night sea battle, the Japanese forces managed to sink several Allied cruisers. This success initially forced the American fleet to retreat. For the American Marines on Guadalcanal, this meant an extremely difficult situation. Many supply ships had left the island, and suddenly the soldiers were left with limited supplies of food, ammunition, and medical equipment. At the same time, Japanese troops began to bring reinforcements to the island. These transports often took place at night and were later referred to by American soldiers as the Tokyo Express. Fast Japanese warships brought soldiers and supplies to the island before retreating again. The fighting on Guadalcanal soon developed into a grueling jungle war. The island was covered by dense rainforest, the climate was hot and humid, and diseases such as malaria spread rapidly. For many soldiers on both sides, fighting nature was just as difficult as fighting the enemy. Japanese troops tried to recapture Henderson Field several times. These attacks often took place at night and were accompanied by fierce fighting. The American defenders had to defend their positions against attacks again and again, while at the same time Japanese artillery and aircraft tried to destroy the airfield. Control over the air was particularly important. As long as Henderson Field remained in American hands, American planes could attack Japanese ships during the day and disrupt their supply lines. This made it increasingly difficult for Japan to bring sufficient reinforcements and supplies to the island. In addition to the fighting on land, there were also several major naval battles around Guadalcanal. Both sides tried to gain control of the waters around the island. These battles often took place at night, as Japanese warships were particularly experienced in night operations. Several of these battles were extremely costly. Cruisers, destroyers, and other warships were sunk or severely damaged. Both sides lost numerous ships and planes, but neither was able to gain a clear advantage at first. As the fighting dragged on, the situation for Japanese troops on the island deteriorated increasingly. Supplies became increasingly scarce, and many soldiers suffered from hunger and disease. At the same time, the United States increased its presence on Guadalcanal and brought additional troops and equipment to the island. In the autumn of 1942, the fighting reached its peak. Japan launched several major offensives to retake Henderson Field. But despite intense attacks, Japanese forces failed to break through the American defenses. The losses on both sides were high. Thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded, and many more died of disease or exhaustion. The Battle of Guadalcanal became one of the toughest and fiercest battles of the entire Pacific War. Eventually, the Japanese leadership realized that the situation had become hopeless. The supply of the troops on the island was hardly possible, and further attacks would probably only have caused higher losses. In February 1943, Japan therefore made the decision to secretly evacuate its remaining troops from Guadalcanal. In several nightly operations, Japanese ships managed to rescue thousands of soldiers from the island. The long battle for Guadalcanal finally ended with a victory for the Allies. This victory had enormous significance for the further course of the war. For the first time, the United States had not only stopped a Japanese offensive, but also permanently recaptured an important territory. Guadalcanal thus marked the beginning of a new phase in the Pacific War. From now on, the Allies were to increasingly go on the offensive and try to break through Japan's line of defense step by step. The victory also showed that Japan was not able to fight successfully on several fronts at the same time. The enormous losses of ships, aircraft, and experienced soldiers significantly weakened Japanese warfare. For the United States, on the other hand, Guadalcanal was an important moral and strategic success. The American forces had proven that they were capable of carrying out difficult offensives and defeating Japanese forces. But the road to victory in the Pacific was still long. The Allies had a huge task ahead of them. They had to reconquer a huge area of islands, bases, and fortified positions. To achieve this goal, the United States developed a new strategy, a strategy that would become known as island hopping and would decisively shape the rest of the war. Chapter 9: Island Hopping, the U.S. Strategy. After the victory at Guadalcanal in early 1943, a new phase began in the Pacific War. For the first time, the Allies had captured a major Japanese position, proving that Japan's seemingly unstoppable expansion could be stopped. But the strategic situation remained extremely complex. The Japanese Empire still stretched over a vast area with thousands of islands, fortified bases, and well-developed defenses. The American military leadership was therefore faced with a difficult question: how could it recapture such a large territory without suffering huge losses in every single battle? Many Japanese bases were heavily fortified. They had artillery, airfields, underground bunkers, and large garrisons. A direct attack on each individual island would probably have taken years and caused enormous casualties. Therefore, American military strategists developed a new approach to the war in the Pacific. This strategy later became known as island hopping. The basic idea behind this strategy was comparatively simple, but militarily extremely effective. Instead of attacking every Japanese position head-on, the Allies were to conquer only certain islands, namely those that had a special strategic importance. Other heavily fortified Japanese bases would be deliberately bypassed and isolated. If an island with airfields or ports was conquered, the Allies could set up their own bases there. From these, planes could take off to attack further Japanese positions or block supply routes. The Japanese garrisons that had been skipped were thus cut off from their supplies and lost their military importance over time. This strategy had several advantages. First, the Allies were able to concentrate their forces on selected targets instead of spreading them across many fronts. Second, the Japanese defenses were weakened, as isolated garrisons could no longer fight effectively. And thirdly, this strategy shortened the Allies' path towards Japan. The implementation of this strategy began as early as 1943. After Guadalcanal had been secured, the next operations were directed at several island groups in the South Pacific. The aim was to build a chain of bases that moved closer and closer to the main Japanese islands. American forces worked closely with Australian units. In New Guinea in particular, several important operations took place in which Japanese positions were pushed back step by step. However, the fighting in New Guinea was extremely difficult. The terrain was characterized by dense jungle, high mountains, and swampy coastal areas. Many roads did not exist, and supplies often had to be transported over long distances. In addition, tropical diseases such as malaria made the deployment of the soldiers more difficult. Despite these challenges, the Allies managed to capture several important territories. With each new base, their ability to carry out airstrikes and prepare for further operations improved. At the same time, a new offensive was also developing in the Central Pacific. Here, the American Navy took on a central role. Aircraft carriers, battleships, and transport fleets were used to conduct amphibious landings on various islands. One of the most important prerequisites for this strategy was control of the air and sea. Before an island was attacked, American planes often attacked Japanese positions for weeks, bombing airfields, artillery positions, and defenses to weaken the defenders. Then the actual invasion began. Thousands of Marines landed on the beaches of the islands in special landing craft. These landings were often extremely dangerous, as the Japanese defenders had carefully prepared their positions. Many islands were surrounded by coral reefs that were difficult for landing craft to pass. At the same time, Japanese soldiers often had machine guns and artillery positioned in well-camouflaged bunkers. As a result, the first waves of the attacking troops were often received under heavy fire. Despite these dangers, the Allies succeeded in many cases in securing bridgeheads and then bringing further reinforcements to the islands. As soon as enough soldiers had landed, intense fighting began in the interior. These battles were often particularly difficult, as many islands were characterized by dense jungle or rugged terrain. Japanese soldiers often used caves, tunnels, and underground bunkers to defend themselves. This allowed them to resist even when their positions were already surrounded. For American soldiers, this meant that many battles became a protracted battle for every single hill or position. Bunkers often had to be taken out with flamethrowers or explosive charges to break the defenses. While these battles were taking place, American engineers were already working to build new airfields on the conquered islands. These airfields enabled the Allies to bring their air forces closer and closer to Japan. With each new base, the pressure on the Japanese defense lines grew. At the same time, it became increasingly difficult for Japan to supply its far-flung garrisons. American submarines and aircraft increasingly attacked Japanese transport ships and interrupted important supply routes. The strategy of island hopping, therefore, quickly had an effect. As the Allies gradually conquered new positions, many Japanese garrisons were isolated and lost their military importance. For the Japanese leadership, this development posed a serious problem. Japan's defense strategy was based on fortifying as many islands as possible and stopping the enemy by fierce defense. But if important bases were simply bypassed, this strategy could no longer work completely. In addition, Japan had increasing difficulties in bringing new soldiers and material to the embattled areas. American industry was now producing large quantities of ships, aircraft, and weapons. This allowed the United States to expand its military presence in the Pacific more and more. Meanwhile, Japan gradually lost experienced pilots, sailors, and soldiers. These losses were particularly problematic as it became increasingly difficult to find sufficiently well-trained replacements. Despite these difficulties, the resistance of the Japanese armed forces remained strong. Many soldiers fought to the end and gave up their positions only with great losses. This attitude led to many battles in the Pacific becoming particularly costly. But overall, the balance of power shifted more and more in favor of the Allies. With each captured base, American planes and warships moved closer to the main Japanese islands. The island hopping strategy thus had a decisive effect. It enabled the United States to systematically break through Japan's defense lines without having to attack every single base head-on. This slow but steady advance paved the way for some of the largest and bloodiest battles of the entire Pacific War. Especially in the Central Pacific, new operations were to begin soon, in which heavily fortified islands were directly attacked. One of these battles was to take place on a small coral island that became a symbol of the harshness of the Pacific War, the Battle of Tarawa. Chapter 10: The Great Battles in the Central Pacific. After the United States had developed its strategy of island hopping, a new phase of the Pacific War began in late 1943. While fighting had previously been mainly in the South Pacific and New Guinea, the focus was now more on the Central Pacific. There were several island groups that were of great strategic importance for the further offensive against Japan. These islands were part of a line of defense that Japan had built up over the course of the war. Many of them were equipped with airfields, bunkers, artillery positions, and underground defenses. Japanese soldiers had prepared to defend each of these bases for as long as possible. For the American military leadership, this meant that the coming operations would be extremely difficult. Unlike some previous landings, many of these islands were small, shallow, and heavily fortified. Attacking troops often had to advance directly onto open beaches, while Japanese defenders fired from well-protected positions. One of the first major battles of this phase took place in November 1943 on the small island of Tarawa. Tarawa belonged to the Gilbert Islands archipelago and, despite its small size, was an important Japanese base. The island had an airfield and was protected by numerous bunkers and gun emplacements. The American Navy carefully prepared the attack. Battleships, cruisers, and planes bombed the island to destroy the Japanese defenses. It was hoped that this bombardment would weaken the defenders so much that the subsequent landing could take place relatively quickly. But the reality was different. When American Marines headed for Tarawa with landing craft on November 20th, 1943, it turned out that many Japanese defensive positions were still intact. In addition, another problem made the landing difficult. The coral reefs around the island prevented many landing craft from reaching the beach directly. Numerous soldiers therefore had to get out far off the coast and walk through waist-deep water to the beach. Meanwhile, they were under heavy machine gun and artillery fire from the Japanese defenders. The first hours of the battle were extremely costly. Many American soldiers have already been hit while trying to reach the beach. Nevertheless, some units managed to secure the first bridgeheads and slowly advance inland. The battles on Tarawa quickly developed into a fierce battle for every single bunker and every single position. Japanese soldiers defended their positions with great determination, using well-camouflaged defenses that were often difficult to detect. American Marines had to take out many of these positions in direct combat. Flamethrowers, explosive charges, and grenades were often used. Step by step, the attacking troops finally managed to overcome the Japanese defensive positions. After 3 days of intense fighting, the island was finally under American control. But the victory came at a high price. Hundreds of American soldiers had been killed, and many more were wounded. Very few of the Japanese defenders survived. The Battle of Tarawa made it clear how difficult and costly the coming operations in the Central Pacific would be. At the same time, however, it also showed that American forces were capable of capturing even heavily fortified positions. After Tarawa, the Allies' attention turned to other island groups in the Pacific. The Marshall Islands, which were further west, were particularly important. These islands served as important military bases for Japan and formed part of the outer line of defense of the Japanese Empire. In January 1944, American forces began invading this archipelago. Unlike Tarawa, this time the American planners chose to bypass some of the most heavily fortified islands and instead attack less heavily defended targets. This approach proved to be successful. Several important islands were conquered within a short period of time, while other Japanese garrisons were left isolated. The American armed forces were thus able to build new airfields and continue their offensive. The next big step led to the Mariana Islands, which had an even greater strategic importance. This archipelago was much closer to Japan than the previously conquered territories. From there, American long-range bombers could reach the main Japanese islands. In the summer of 1944, therefore, a new major offensive against the Mariana Islands began. In particular, the islands of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian were the focus of the operations. The Battle of Saipan quickly developed into one of the largest and fiercest battles of the Pacific War. Thousands of American Marines and soldiers landed on the island and encountered a large Japanese garrison. The fighting lasted several weeks and was characterized by great intensity. Japanese soldiers stubbornly defended their positions, using the hilly terrain and numerous caves as defensive positions. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy tried to stop the American invasion. A large fleet was sent to attack the American carrier units. But in the ensuing naval battle, Japan suffered heavy losses, especially in aircraft and pilots. After long battles, Saipan finally fell into American hands. This victory had far-reaching consequences. The Mariana Islands now allowed the United States to prepare strategic bombing raids on Japan. Guam and Tinian were also eventually conquered, further strengthening the American position in the Pacific. Large air bases were established on these islands, from which numerous missions were later launched. With these successes, the Allies had broken through an important part of the Japanese defense line. At the same time, they moved closer and closer to Japan itself. But with each new operation, it also became clear that the fighting would become tougher and tougher. The Japanese leadership was determined to defend the remaining islands with all available forces. Many soldiers fought until the last moment and gave up their positions only with extreme losses. This attitude made the Pacific War one of the most brutal theaters of war of World War II. However, the major battles in the Central Pacific had shown that the American strategy worked. With a combination of air superiority, a strong naval presence, and targeted landings, the Allies succeeded in pushing Japan's defenses further and further back. While the front was moving closer and closer to the main Japanese islands, the American leadership was already beginning to plan the next big step. This step was to be a return to a place that had a special meaning for the United States, the Philippines. Chapter 11: Returning to the Philippines. As the United States advanced further and further west in the course of 1944, one target increasingly became the focus of American strategy: the Philippines. This archipelago of islands had not only great strategic importance, but also a strong symbolic effect for the United States. 3 years earlier, the islands had fallen to Japan after heavy fighting. At that time, General Douglas MacArthur, before he had to leave the islands on the orders of the American government, had made a promise: "I shall return." Now, in 1944, the time seemed to have come to make good on this promise. The Philippines was located at a crucial point in the Western Pacific. They were located between Japan and the resource-rich areas of Southeast Asia, from which Japan continued to source important resources. If the Allies were to regain control of the Philippines, they could massively disrupt Japanese supply lines and further isolate the Japanese Empire. However, the American military leadership initially discussed various options. Some strategists suggested bypassing the Philippines and instead directly attacking other targets. But in the end, the view prevailed that the reconquest of the islands made sense both militarily and politically. In October 1944, the Great Offensive finally began. On October 20th, American troops landed on Leyte Island, which is one of the central islands of the archipelago. Thousands of soldiers landed on the beaches, supported by a huge fleet of warships, transporters, and aircraft carriers. When General MacArthur went ashore a few hours after landing, he spoke a famous message to the people of the Philippines. In a radio show, he declared, "I have returned." For many Filipinos, this was a moment of great hope, because the years of Japanese occupation had left deep marks. But the return of the Allies also marked the beginning of one of the largest and most complex military operations of the Pacific War. Japan was aware of the importance of the Philippines and was determined to defend the islands with all its might. Particularly important was the control of the surrounding waters. If the Japanese Navy were to succeed in destroying the American invasion fleet, the landing troops could be isolated and possibly pushed back. For this reason, Japan developed a comprehensive plan to engage the American forces in a major naval battle. Several naval formations were to attack at the same time and try to destroy the American aircraft carriers and transport ships. This operation eventually led to one of the largest naval battles in all of war history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In October 1944, huge naval formations met in the area of the Philippines. The fighting lasted several days and included various partial battles in different sea areas. Japan deployed almost all of its remaining navy. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers were pulled together in several attack groups. The plan was to distract the American carrier formations and at the same time advance with heavy battleships into the Gulf of Leyte, where the American landing ships were located. The battle developed into a series of complex battles. In some areas, Japanese ships managed to get surprisingly close to American units. A situation in which a Japanese battleship group met a relatively small American escort fleet became particularly dangerous. Despite the enormous firepower of the Japanese battleships, however, the American ships managed to gain time with courageous counterattacks. Destroyers and smaller escort ships attacked the Japanese units, while American aircraft repeatedly carried out attacks from the air. Finally, the Japanese naval units had to withdraw. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended in a heavy defeat for Japan. Several large warships were lost, including some of the last large battleships of the Japanese Navy. A particularly notable event of this battle was the increased use of so-called kamikaze attacks. These were suicide attacks by Japanese pilots who deliberately steered their planes into enemy ships. These attacks caused considerable damage and showed how desperate the Japanese situation had become. With the outcome of the naval battle, control of the waters around the Philippines was also largely decided. The Japanese Navy lost a large part of its remaining striking power and could hardly stop the further advance of the Allies. But the battle for the Philippines itself was far from over. After the landing on Leyte, American and Filipino troops began to advance inland. The fighting was difficult because Japanese soldiers took advantage of the mountainous terrain, dense forests, and prepared defensive positions. Heavy fighting later developed, especially on the main island of Luzon. In early 1945, American troops landed near the Gulf of Lingayen and began their advance towards the capital Manila. The Battle of Manila became one of the most destructive city battles of the Pacific War. Japanese units defended the city with great severity, while American troops tried to conquer the city piece by piece. Many buildings were destroyed and the civilian population suffered severely from the fighting. After weeks of fighting, the American forces finally succeeded in taking Manila completely. The fighting also continued for a long time in other parts of the Philippines. Many Japanese units retreated to remote areas and continued the resistance. In some regions, fighting continued months later. But overall, the strategic situation was now clear. With the reconquest of the Philippines, the United States had taken a decisive step in the Pacific War. Japan's connections to the sources of raw materials in Southeast Asia were now severely restricted. American planes and submarines were able to attack Japanese transport ships and disrupt important supply lines. At the same time, the Allies now had large military bases in the Philippines. From here, further operations could be prepared, bringing them closer and closer to the main Japanese islands. For General MacArthur, his promise had been fulfilled. After 3 years, he had actually returned to the Philippines and played a central role in their liberation. But although this victory was an important milestone, the war was now approaching a particularly brutal phase. The closer the Allies came to Japan itself, the fiercer the resistance of the Japanese armed forces became. The ensuing battles were to show how difficult a possible invasion of Japan's main islands would be. 2 islands in particular were to become symbols of the extreme harshness of the last phase of the Pacific War, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Chapter 12: Kamikaze and Japan's Desperate Resistance. In the course of 1944, Japan's situation in the Pacific War had deteriorated dramatically. The Allies had regained large parts of the previously conquered territories and were moving closer and closer to the main Japanese islands. With the reconquest of the Philippines, Japan lost an important strategic position, and at the same time supplies from the resource-rich regions of Southeast Asia were increasingly interrupted. It became increasingly clear to the Japanese military leadership that the war could no longer be won in the previous form. The industrial and military strength of the United States was now overwhelming. American shipyards produced new aircraft carriers, battleships, and transport fleets at a rapid pace. At the same time, thousands of planes were produced, which bombed Japan's defensive positions more and more frequently. The Japanese Navy had also suffered heavy losses. Especially after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan had only a small part of its original fleet left. Many experienced pilots had been killed, and the lack of fuel made it difficult to use the remaining aircraft. In this situation, the Japanese military leadership looked for new ways to stop the advance of the Allies. One of these measures was the increased use of so-called kamikaze attacks. The term kamikaze translates as divine wind. The name goes back to a historical event from the 13th century, when a typhoon destroyed a Mongol invasion fleet that wanted to attack Japan. In World War II propaganda, this term was used to describe a new military strategy. In kamikaze attacks, Japanese pilots deliberately steered their aircraft into enemy ships. These planes were often loaded with bombs, and the impact was intended to cause as much damage as possible. Since the pilot was not trying to survive, he was able to steer his plane directly to the target at high speed. This tactic arose from the idea that a well-aimed impact could cause more damage than an ordinary bombing raid. At the same time, the training of new pilots had become difficult, and many of the aircraft used were technically obsolete. Kamikaze attacks were intended to compensate for these disadvantages. The first major use of these attacks took place during the battles for the Philippines. Japanese pilots attacked American warships, causing several heavy hits. Some ships were badly damaged or sunk. For the American sailors, this new form of attack was initially shocking. Unlike in normal air raids, the pilots did not try to evade or escape. Instead, they steered their machines directly towards the target, often at high speed. Soon, additional defensive measures were developed. American ships strengthened their anti-aircraft defenses and used fighter planes to intercept approaching kamikaze aircraft at an early stage. Nevertheless, many attackers managed to achieve their goals. The kamikaze attacks were used more and more frequently in the course of the war. Hundreds of Japanese pilots took part in these missions. Many of them were very young and had only received a short education. In Japanese propaganda, These pilots were portrayed as heroes who sacrificed their lives for their country. Ceremonies and farewell rituals often accompanied her last hours before the mission. Many pilots wrote farewell letters to their families before boarding their planes. But although these attacks sometimes caused considerable damage, they were ultimately unable to change the course of the war decisively. The American Navy had enough ships and resources to make up for the losses. Meanwhile, the situation within Japan also worsened. American planes increasingly attacked Japanese cities and industrial plants. Especially after American long-range bombers were able to operate from bases in the Pacific, many Japanese cities were regularly bombed. These attacks destroyed factories, residential areas, and transport infrastructure. The supply of food and raw materials became increasingly difficult, and many people suffered from the consequences of the war. Despite these developments, the Japanese leadership remained determined to continue the resistance. Many military leaders believed that a particularly tough resistance might force the Allies to think about peace negotiations. This strategy was based on the hope that high losses in the event of a possible invasion of Japan could persuade the American government to compromise. Therefore, the defense of the remaining islands was prepared with great intensity. Japanese soldiers were ordered to defend their positions until the last moment. Surrender was considered dishonorable in many cases. This attitude led to many battles in the Pacific being particularly brutal. Japan also continued to rely on risky strategies at sea. In some cases, specially equipped boats or manned torpedoes were even used, where the crew had little chance of survival. These weapons were intended to surprise American ships and cause serious damage. But despite these desperate measures, the military situation remained difficult for Japan. The Allies now controlled large parts of the Pacific and were able to strengthen their forces further and further. American aircraft carriers dominated many sea areas, while submarines attacked Japanese trade routes. This made it increasingly difficult for Japan to supply its troops and produce new weapons. While these developments were emerging, the Allies were already preparing the next major operations. The goal was to conquer islands that were even closer to Japan's main islands. These operations were to become particularly difficult as the Japanese defenses grew stronger. Many soldiers were ready to fight to the end, and the defenses became more and more sophisticated. The battles that followed were to show how stubborn this resistance could be. Two islands were to become symbols of the extreme intensity of the final phase of the Pacific War, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. There it would become clear how far Japan was willing to go to defend its homeland, and what enormous losses the war would still claim in its last months. Chapter 13, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. In 1945, the Second World War in the Pacific had approached its last and at the same time most brutal phase. After the recapture of the Philippines and the heavy losses of the Japanese Navy, the Allies had moved closer and closer to the main Japanese islands. The American military leadership was now preparing the next steps that would ultimately decide the war. However, in order to attack Japan directly, the United States needed additional bases in the Pacific. Islands from which American planes could take off were particularly important. These airfields were intended to make it possible to carry out bomber missions over Japan and to provide safe landing facilities for damaged aircraft. Two islands in particular became the focus of American planning: Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima was a small volcanic island about halfway between the Mariana Islands and the main Japanese islands. Although it was relatively small, it had great strategic importance. Japanese planes used the airfield there to intercept American bombers on their way to Japan. In addition, Japanese radar stations were able to detect American airstrikes from the island at an early stage. If the United States were to capture Iwo Jima, it would be able to eliminate this threat and at the same time gain an important base for its own aircraft. The Japanese leadership knew how important this island was, and prepared its defense accordingly carefully. Unlike in previous battles, this time the Japanese military opted for a new defense strategy. Instead of stopping the American troops on the beach, the defenders built an extensive network of underground bunkers, tunnels, and caves. These installations allowed Japanese soldiers to protect themselves from bombardment while carrying out surprise attacks. For weeks, American warships and planes bombed the island to destroy the defenses. But many of the underground positions remained intact. On February 19, 1945, the American invasion finally began. Thousands of Marines landed on the beaches of Iwo Jima. But it immediately became clear that this battle would be different from many previous landings. The beaches consisted of soft volcanic sand, which made it difficult for soldiers and vehicles to advance. At the same time, Japanese machine guns and artillery opened fire from well-camouflaged positions. Already in the first hours, the American troops suffered heavy losses. Nevertheless, they managed to slowly work their way inland. A central target was Mount Suribachi, an extinct volcano in the south of the island. This hill provided an excellent observation position for the Japanese defenders and therefore had to be conquered. After several days of intense fighting, American Marines finally managed to reach the summit. There they hoisted an American flag, a moment that later became one of the most famous images of the entire war. But although this symbolic success attracted a lot of attention, the battle was far from over. Most of the Japanese defensive positions were located in the northern part of the island. There, the soldiers had built a complex tunnel system that allowed them to move between different positions and launch surprise attacks again and again. The battles developed into a grueling battle for every bunker, every cave, and every defensive position. American soldiers had to take out many of these positions individually, often using flamethrowers and explosive charges. The fighting lasted for weeks. It was not until March 1945 that the United States was finally able to take complete control of the island. The losses were enormous. Thousands of American soldiers had been killed or wounded. Very few of the Japanese defenders survived. Despite these high sacrifices, the conquest of Iwo Jima was of great strategic importance. The island became an important base for American aircraft. Many damaged bombers were able to land there after flying missions over Japan. But while the fighting on Iwo Jima was still ongoing, the Allies were already preparing the next major operation, the invasion of Okinawa. Okinawa is much closer to Japan's main islands than any previously conquered territory. The island was large enough to accommodate several airfields and could have served as a starting point for a possible invasion of Japan. This is precisely why the defense of Okinawa was crucial for Japan. On April 1, 1945, the American landing on Okinawa began. More than 100,000 soldiers went ashore, supported by a huge fleet of warships and aircraft carriers. At first, the resistance seemed surprisingly low. Many American soldiers were able to advance relatively quickly into the interior. But this impression was deceptive. The Japanese defenders had built up their main positions in the southern part of the island. There they took advantage of the hilly terrain and built a complex system of bunkers, caves, and defensive lines. When the American troops reached these defensive positions, one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Pacific War began. The fighting lasted almost 3 months. Both sides used large quantities of artillery, aircraft, and infantry. The Japanese defenders fought with great determination and tried again and again to stop the American advance. At the same time, Japan intensified its kamikaze attacks on the American fleet. Hundreds of planes attacked the warships around Okinawa. Several ships were damaged or sunk, and many sailors lost their lives. The fight was also extremely difficult for the soldiers on land. Rain, mud, and the difficult terrain made it difficult to advance. Every line of defense had to be conquered with great losses. The situation was particularly tragic for the civilian population of Okinawa. Many residents got caught between the fronts and suffered from the heavy fighting. In June 1945, the battle finally ended with an Allied victory. But the price was high. Tens of thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded, and there were also great casualties among the civilian population. The Battle of Okinawa had far-reaching consequences. It showed how fierce Japan's resistance could be, even if the military situation was already hopeless. It became increasingly clear to the American leadership that a direct invasion of the main Japanese islands would probably cause enormous losses. As the war seemed to be coming to an end, the world was faced with a decision that would permanently change the course of history. This decision was to be made only a few weeks later, with events that would finally end the Second World War in the Pacific. Chapter 14: The Atomic Bombs and the End of the War. In the summer of 1945, the Second World War in the Pacific was in its final phase. Japanese military power was severely weakened, many of its most important bases had fallen, and American forces were now in close proximity to Japan's main islands. Nevertheless, the war was not yet over. Despite the difficult situation, the Japanese leadership continued to show little willingness to capitulate. For the United States, a difficult strategic question now arose. A direct invasion of Japan's main island seemed possible, but the experience of the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown how stubbornly Japanese soldiers fought. Many American military planners feared that an invasion would cause enormous losses on both sides. While these deliberations were taking place, scientists in the United States were already working on a new and extremely secret weapon. For several years, a large research program had been underway, which became known as the Manhattan Project. The aim of this project was to develop an entirely new type of bomb, a weapon that would derive its energy from the fission of atomic nuclei. The development of this weapon was a huge scientific and technical effort. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers were involved in various locations to produce materials, perform calculations, and eventually build a working bomb. Finally, in July 1945, the first successful test of such a bomb was carried out. In the New Mexico desert, the world's first atomic bomb exploded, creating a massive explosion that exceeded anything that had previously been possible with conventional weapons. With this success, the American government now had a new military option at its disposal. President Harry S. Truman had to decide how to use this new weapon. The American leadership hoped that the use of the atomic bomb could force Japan to surrender quickly. At the same time, the bomb was intended to show the military power that the United States now had at its disposal. In August 1945, the use of the new weapon was finally decided. On the morning of August 6, 1945, an American bomber with an atomic bomb on board took off from a military base in the Pacific. His destination was the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Hiroshima was an important military and industrial city. At the same time, it had been largely spared the heavy bombing that many other Japanese cities had already experienced. Shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning, the bomb was dropped over the city. A few seconds later, it detonated at a high altitude over Hiroshima. The explosion was enormous. In an instant, a large part of the city was destroyed. Buildings collapsed, fires broke out, and a huge blast wave spread in all directions. Numerous people lost their lives immediately. Many more were seriously injured or later suffered serious health consequences from the radiation from the explosion. News of the destruction of Hiroshima spread quickly. For the Japanese leadership, however, it was not initially completely clear what kind of weapon had been used. While the government in Tokyo was discussing the situation, the American Air Force was already preparing another mission. On August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. Here, too, the explosion led to devastating destruction. Two large cities had been almost completely destroyed within a few days. At the same time, Japan's military situation continued to deteriorate. The Soviet Army also began an offensive against Japanese forces in Manchuria in those days. In view of these developments, the situation for Japan became increasingly hopeless. Intense discussions began within the government about whether the war should be continued or ended. Some military leaders wanted to continue to resist. They hoped that a particularly hard fight might persuade the Allies to more favorable peace conditions. However, other voices within the government were convinced that a continuation of the war would only bring further destruction. Finally, the Japanese emperor himself intervened in the discussion. In an extraordinary decision, he supported the plan to end the war. On August 15, 1945, Japan's surrender was publicly announced. In a radio address, the Kaiser declared that Japan would accept the Allies' conditions. For many people in Japan, this was a historic moment. For the first time, they heard the voice of their emperor on the radio. At the same time, this speech marked the end of a long and destructive war. In the following weeks, preparations for the formal surrender began. On September 2, 1945, representatives of Japan finally officially signed the instrument of surrender aboard an American warship in Tokyo Bay. This finally ended the Second World War in the Pacific. However, the events around Hiroshima and Nagasaki had not only ended the war, but also ushered in a new era of history. For the first time, nuclear weapons had been used in a war. The enormous destructive power of these weapons made it clear that future conflicts could take on completely new dimensions. At the same time, after the war, an intensive discussion began about the moral and political questions associated with the use of the atomic bomb. Historians, politicians, and scientists debated whether this decision had been necessary or whether there would have been other ways to end the war. Regardless of these debates, it is clear that the events of August 1945 permanently changed the course of world history. Japan's surrender ended not only the Pacific War, but also the entire Second World War. Millions of people around the world now hoped for a time of peace and reconstruction. But at the same time, a new phase of international politics was already beginning, a phase in which the power of nuclear weapons and the rivalry of the great powers would shape world politics for decades. Chapter 15: Consequences of the Pacific War. When Japan's formal surrender was signed in September 1945, not only the Pacific War ended, but also the entire Second World War. For many people around the world, this moment meant the end of years of fear, destruction, and uncertainty. But although the fighting was over, a new phase of the story began. The consequences of the Pacific War were to shape the political order, societies, and international relations for decades to come. Japan itself faced an enormous challenge after the war. Many cities had been destroyed by bombing, infrastructure was badly damaged, and the economy was in tatters. Millions of people had lost their homes, and the supply of food and other essential goods was difficult. After the surrender, Japan was occupied by the Allies. The leadership of this occupation was mainly taken over by the United States. The aim was to stabilize the country, support reconstruction, and at the same time ensure that Japan would not go to war in the future. One of the first measures was to fundamentally change Japan's political structure. The role of the military, which had previously had great influence on politics, was severely restricted. At the same time, a comprehensive reform of the political system began. A new constitution was introduced, which placed greater emphasis on democratic principles. Particularly important was an article of this constitution that stipulated that Japan should renounce war as a means of politics. In doing so, the country officially committed itself to a peaceful foreign policy. In addition to political reforms, economic changes also took place. Many large industrial groups were restructured, land reforms changed the ownership structure of agriculture, and new institutions were intended to enable stable economic development. The reconstruction of Japan was a long process, but in the decades that followed, the country developed into one of the largest economic powers in the world. This development showed how profoundly Japan had changed after the war. The Pacific War also had a major impact in other parts of Asia. During the war, many regions had been controlled by European colonial powers. But the events of the war had severely shaken these colonial structures. Strong independence movements emerged in several countries after the war. People who had experienced how European colonial powers had been defeated during the war now increasingly demanded political self-determination. In the years after the war, many countries in Asia therefore gained their independence. This development changed the political map of the region considerably. China was also strongly influenced by the events of the war. The long conflict with Japan had weighed heavily on the country, and after the end of the war, civil war between different political groups continued. Eventually, this conflict led to the establishment of new political systems in various parts of China. For the United States, the Pacific War also had profound consequences. During the war, enormous economic and industrial capacities had been built. After the war, the U.S. had one of the strongest economies in the world and a very powerful Navy and Air Force. This development made the United States one of the leading global powers. At the same time, new political tensions began with other large states, especially with the Soviet Union. In the decades that followed, this rivalry developed into a period of international tension that became known as the Cold War. The importance of the Pacific in international politics also increased significantly after the war. Regions that had previously tended to be on the fringes of world politics now became important strategic areas. Military bases, trade routes, and political alliances played an increasingly important role in this region. Another important consequence of the war was the new importance of nuclear weapons. The use of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown the enormous destructive power of these weapons. Many countries therefore began to deal more intensively with nuclear technology issues. In the years after the war, an international arms race for nuclear weapons developed. At the same time, however, initial efforts were made to create international agreements that would limit the use of such weapons. In addition to the political and military consequences, the Pacific War also had a profound impact on the societies of the countries involved. Millions of soldiers returned to their homeland after the war and had to find their way back into civilian life. Many families mourned relatives who had fallen in the war. Others had to live with the physical and psychological consequences of the fighting. These experiences shaped entire generations and influenced the culture of remembrance in many countries. Relations between former war opponents also changed over time. Countries that had been bitter enemies during the war later developed new forms of cooperation. An example of this is the close economic and political cooperation between Japan and the United States in the post-war period. Despite the heavy battles that the two countries had fought against each other, a stable partnership developed in the decades that followed. At the same time, the memory of the war remained present in many regions. To this day, memorials, museums, and historical studies commemorate the events of the Pacific War and the people who were affected by it. World War II in the Pacific was one of the greatest conflicts in modern history. It stretched over vast distances, encompassed numerous countries, and brought countless people into direct contact with the consequences of the war. But this period of destruction also gave rise to new political structures, international organizations, and efforts to prevent future conflicts. The history of the Pacific War reminds us how quickly political tensions can escalate into major conflicts, but also the importance of cooperation, diplomacy, and international understanding. Today, many decades after the end of the war, this history remains an important part of the world's collective memory. It helps us understand the past and learn lessons for the future.